Hi, I'm Lily. I'm not a pro athlete. I'm a data analyst who loves working out. It's my favourite mood enhancing drug. It's a big part of how I care for my mental health, and it's how I keep my mind sharp for long stretches of data analysis. I did a 6-month experiment where I did the same fitness tests every week on top of my usual workout routine, and I collected and analysed this data, all so I could find out how my menstrual cycle affects my athletic performance. It all started when I stumbled across this TED Talk by James Smith. The main premise was that there are physiological differences between men and women that we can't ignore when it comes to women's fitness. Namely that there are weeks in the menstrual cycle that are optimal for training, and weeks where performance dips and chance of injury is higher. And if you're a woman measuring your progress, looking at your physique and metrics week on week isn't productive. We should be comparing week 1 with week 1, week 2 with week 2, and so on. I was like, holy shit, this is such a big part of my life, but I never considered how something that happens every month affects it. So I got to researching, and this is what I could piece together about what happens during the cycle for us women. In an average 28-day or 4-week cycle, there are 2 main phases. The first half, starting with our period, is the follicular phase. The second half, starting after ovulation, is the luteal phase. In the follicular phase, we start with hormone levels at their lowest, then a spike in estrogen, which makes us feel good and energized. Spikes in 2 other hormones trigger ovulation: follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, the same hormone that causes the production of testosterone in men. In the luteal phase, we get a rise in progesterone and estrogen, which can make us feel uncomfortable and not the greatest. Then right before the period, we get a quick drop in progesterone and estrogen, which means a quick drop in the hormones that make us feel calm. This describes a natural period, but some research shows that women taking an oral contraceptive pill still show a small underlying rhythm of the menstrual cycle. On the one hand, there are studies that say the best athletic performance happens here, in the follicular phase, which makes sense if that's when we feel stronger, calmer, and more energetic. But on the other hand, there are studies that say even though the changing hormone levels affect how the body feels, it doesn't affect athletic performance. It's something that's not studied cleanly and consistently enough, which I'll talk more on later. But studies aside, I wanted to know how my cycle affects me, with my fitness level and training program and physiology. So I got to working on my own study. I usually work out 4 days a week, starting on a Monday, with a split of 2 strength training days, then 2 high-intensity interval training days. I decided every week on a Monday I would do fitness tests measuring my strength and endurance. The idea was on a Monday I would be recovered from the week before, what I was doing during the week wouldn't skew the results, and I would be able to cleanly compare each week of the cycle to each other. I also decided I would do this over 6 months so I could get more data points. There's a few quick caveats. The first is I lived the rest of my life like normal for 6 months, so things like sleep, diet, alcohol consumption, they weren't consistent, but that's okay. I wanted to get learnings about my performance in and amongst my usual messy life. The second is I got bronchitis at the end of last year. I still worked out, but I didn't run for 3 weeks, so I've got some missing data. Okay, let's get to the results. The first thing I found out was my cycle was not regular at all. I had just come off the pill. I was expecting 6 cycles in 6 months, and to be able to compare the weeks of 1 through to 4 of each cycle. Instead, I got 8 cycles of different lengths, including 1 cycle of only 1 week, which I excluded from most of my findings. To make things simpler, I labelled each week based on where they were in relation to my period. Week 1 was the week of my period. Week 2 was the week after my period. And the week before my period, whether it was week 2, 3, or 4, was the week before my period. The only thing to call out is that there were less of the week after, because in 2-week cycles, it was only the week of, and I assumed the week before. The reason why I assumed this is because I took notes on how I felt each week, and my experience in these weeks were closer to what a week before is meant to feel like compared to a week after, if that makes sense. Okay, let's go through the results of each test. And I really want to show you my logic and thinking process behind how I came to my conclusions. I've grouped each test by strength versus endurance, and more specifically anaerobic exercises, which use the fuel in your muscles to make energy for shorter, more intense bursts, versus aerobic exercises, which use oxygen to make energy for longer, more sustained activity. The first test was a 30-meter sprint. Because sprinting uses maximum energy for a short burst, it's actually an anaerobic exercise and helps build muscle in the same way that weightlifting does. 30 meters is from here to there, and I chose this distance to consistently test a short burst of speed before the body changes to a different anaerobic fuel system. I did 2 tests each week, and my partner Dan timed them using the stopwatch on his phone. Then I used the best time of each week for my analysis. This was the distribution of my best times in a box and whisker plot. My fastest time was 5.29 seconds. My slowest time was 5.68 seconds. Halfway, or the median, was 5.43 seconds. And there were no outliers, which would be out here or here. The hypothesis is performance is better in the follicular phase, and therefore worse in the luteal phase. So if I've got results for each week of the menstrual cycle, where week 1 is the week of my period, week 2 is the week after, and the last week of the cycle is the week before my next period, in order for the hypothesis to be true, the results would need to be worse in the week before my period compared to the week of and the week after. Out of the 6 cycles that I've data for, the hypothesis was true for 3 of them. This is a different way of visualizing a distribution of data, in a density curve. I've set the ends of the curve to represent the minimum and the maximum values. The curve is a smooth line that represents the spread of data across the x-axis of sprint times, and the y-axis represents how frequently the data values occur in the distribution. This curve represents the week of my period, and here are the week after and the week before. Overall, the distributions look similar. There's more overlap than there is difference between them. Here are the averages. The average times for the week after look slightly faster, but is it significant? And remember, there's less data points for the week after. Let's look at the sprint times I have for the week after my period, comparing them with the corresponding sprint times in the week before my period. There was one cycle where I was faster by 0.21 seconds. In the other 3 cycles, there was either no difference or a small 1% difference. Let's take this a step further and calculate a confidence interval. Based on the average and the spread of these time differences in this sample, we can be 95% confident that the average difference in performance will be between minus 0.23 seconds and 0.08 seconds. So sometimes I'll be faster in the week after my period, and sometimes I'll be slower. In going back to these distributions, this difference in averages is 90 milliseconds, which is shorter than this, and an improvement of 2%. Considering we time the sprints with human reflexes, this isn't a significant difference. So this is all to say that performance wasn't consistently or significantly better in any one week. And actually, I'm really happy about that. I'm really impressed that the results are so close. The bigger indicator of performance was time. These are my sprint times plotted across the 22 weeks of the experiment. There was a moderate trend down over time, which is more consistent with the idea of me growing the muscles needed for sprinting over a few months, rather than it being influenced by my cycle on a monthly basis. The next test was max reps of push-ups in a row, using only body weight and no time limit. Just however many I could fang out before collapsing. The highest number of reps I got was 33. The lowest was 21. The median was 26, and there were no outliers. Out of the 7 cycles that I have data for, the hypothesis that performance is better in the follicular phase was true for 4 of them. These are the distributions of results by week of cycle. There's overlap here, but the week before and week after look really different. They're skewed in different directions. If we look at the averages, the difference is like half a push-up. but an average can be skewed by the minimum or maximum values. So because of this skew, let's also look at median, which tells us half the results are on one side and half the results are on the other side. And actually here, half the results were exactly 28 push-ups. If we use the medians as the center values, I achieved 3 push-ups or 12% more in the week after my period compared to the week before. There's still the issue of the week after having less data points, and I actually achieved some personal bests in the week before my period, so I'd need more data to comfortably make that conclusion. Looking at the results over time, there's a slight but insignificant trend upwards over the 22 weeks, but it's a crapshoot. So to sum up push-ups, this testosterone spike here maybe means I can push further with a few more reps. The next test was max reps of deadlifts in a row. I used 2 15-kilo dumbbells, 30 kilos in total. Why? I didn't have one of these at the beginning of the experiment. All I had were these, which leaked a mysterious black powder, and the highest they went up to was 15 kilos. Halfway through the experiment though, I did upgrade to these sexy sleek ones. Again, no time limit, just however many I could do before I felt a hernia coming on. The highest number of reps was 40, the lowest was 25, the median was 33.5, and there were no outliers. Out of the 7 cycles that I have data for, the hypothesis that performance is better in the follicular phase was true for 2 of them. These are the distributions of reps by week of cycle. They look very similar, and the difference in averages is like a third of a deadlift. Even the medians are very close together. Over time, there was a slight trend upwards over the 22 weeks, so overall, no impact on number of deadlifts. The next test was VO2 max during a run between 1 and 2 kilometers. VO2 max measures your heart and lungs' max capacity to carry oxygen to your muscles during aerobic exercise. I care about this metric because it's an indicator of longevity. Studies show that through high-intensity interval training, you can increase your VO2 max, reverse your fitness age, and potentially live longer. So how do you measure it? Traditionally, you would do it in a lab test where they measure how much oxygen you're breathing in and out while you're exercising. You can estimate VO2 max using a fitness tracker like this, where it uses heart rate and probably other data like running speed, gender, age, and weight. Garmin trackers are apparently accurate within 5%, and at the very least they should be consistently inconsistent. My VO2 max didn't change much at all over the 22 weeks. It sat at 45 and 46 the whole time, even after I didn't run for 3 weeks, which A is good to know, and B tells me it's a longer term metric to move and I don't really need to worry about it fluctuating on a week-to-week basis. When I did these runs with VO2 max, the tracker also collected interesting secondary data like speed and max heart rate, and I thought, great, 2 birds, 1 stone, kind of, if I'm reading the data right. How long you run for when you're testing for VO2 max is specific to each run. In a lab environment, you gradually increase the intensity of exercise until your oxygen consumption plateaus. This signals that your body has switched from aerobic back to anaerobic, and you're no longer using oxygen to fuel your muscles. I assume the Garmin tracker is calculating when this happens too, because each time I did a running test to measure VO2 max, it started off by saying run for 15 minutes, but then it stopped me at different times each week saying the test was complete. The longer the time it got me to run, the slower my average speed was. Especially on this doozy of a day, when it didn't stop me until I ran for 13 minutes straight. I assume these test times reflect the amount of time I could sustain a max effort run before my oxygen consumption plateaued. And I also assume these speeds are a symptom of how long I had to run for, as in I paced myself because I was tired and the test was still going. These are the distributions of my test times and running speeds by week of cycle. On average, I ran for 1.5 minutes or 22% longer in the week after versus the week before my period. But my average speed was only 3% slower. Let's look at what was happening with max heart rate during these VO2 max runs. The distributions have a lot of overlap, and whether we look at averages or medians, there's only a difference of 2 heartbeats per minute between the week after and the week before. So throughout my cycle, I could get to the same level of max effort in terms of heart rate and speed, but in the week after my period, I could sustain it for 22% longer, which is pretty significant. This was the most interesting finding, but take it with a huge grain of salt because of the small number of data points, and it's based on an assumption of what the secondary metrics mean. If I were to do this again, I would test speed and max heart rate in a separate test where I run the same distance each week to see the true difference. I didn't see any significant changes in resting heart rate and body temperature between week of cycle. I measured resting heart rate using the Garmin tracker in my sleep on Monday nights because I wanted to track my body's ability to recover from the tests. Over time, there was a moderate trend down, which was great to see. But if I were to do this again, I would have also tracked resting heart rate the night before as well. That way I'd be able to see if I started on a higher heart rate the week before my period. I didn't see as big a change in my body temperature, like half a degree, like what some studies show, but I was measuring skin temperature rather than core temperature. And over time, body temperature went up for me because here in Australia we went from winter to summer. So I didn't see any of the baseline changes that studies claim happened the week before our period, but it could have been because of how I was measuring. Here are my top takeaways from this experience. What I take from my findings is that my menstrual cycle doesn't affect performance in things that I'm good at and train for most often. I'm more strength and anaerobically based, and the compound lifts I focus on are back squats and deadlifts, so working on leg strength. And my performance for sprinting and deadlifts weren't significantly affected. But my menstrual cycle potentially did affect how long I could run at max effort for, and maybe push-ups, which I consider to be more my weaknesses. And what's interesting to compare is performance between the week before and the week after our period, when women get a spike in testosterone. Having said that, I learned that I shouldn't take it easier the week before my period. I learned that there's a really big difference between how I felt, mentally and physically, and what the data says about my performance. I consistently wrote in my notes that lifts felt harder, running felt more painful, I felt like I had no endurance, and it was hard to regulate my breathing. When I knew it was the week before my period, I would have the mentality of, I'm not going to perform today, or that was shit because of my period. And in my regular training, where I work on lifting heavier and heavier each month, sometimes I deliberately went 5 to 10 kilos lighter because I went in feeling like I couldn't do it. But looking at the data now, I got personal bests in the week before my period. I'm really happy with my overall performance across the month. I'm proud of the long-term trends that I've achieved with consistent weekly training. So the week before my period, I'm going to stop going in thinking this week is any different, and go for gold every time, no matter which week of the cycle I'm in. Gather as much data as you can. I didn't go into the statistical significance of whether the hypothesis was true, because it'd be really hard for me to achieve this without either studying more people at the same time or studying myself every week for a few years. But the more data that you have, the more confident you can be in your findings. I found that 6 months worth of data wasn't enough for me because my cycle is so irregular, which leads me on to my next takeaway. Make it sustainable. You might ask, why didn't you just keep going and do this for a year? And the answer is, I mentally couldn't. I was loading on so much on a Monday, and towards the end of it, I got so sick of it. But if I had gone in thinking about 1 or 2 things to test this year and 1 or 2 things to test next year, I may have had more patience with that. I didn't track things like my size or my weight, which would have been interesting to measure across the cycle, but it's not why I work out. I work out because it makes me feel strong in all aspects of my life. And something I wish I'd done a better job of was tracking my mental health. I took brief notes each week which captured the low points around my period, but I wish I'd also taken note of when I felt sharp, motivated, calm, bulletproof. How much does good headspace drive better performance? Or does good headspace come from working out? I'll leave you with this. During this process, it was really eye-opening that most of what we know about the female menstrual cycle is studied in relation to reproduction. What happens before and during pregnancy, and what happens when women are no longer of reproductive age. There's much fewer studies on the effect of the menstrual cycle on day-to-day life when we're not in these reproductive stages. which is most of our lives. There's even fewer studies on the effect of the menstrual cycle on exercise, which we all agree is good for us. And the studies that do exist don't consistently build a foundation of understanding, because the way phases of the cycle are defined varies. It's expensive to verify which phase women are in, and they're not widespread enough to capture a good cross-section of the population. My findings are based on a sample size of 1, and they're specific to me. My physiology, my genetic makeup, my fitness level, my training program, my diet. If you're a woman, I implore you to get to know your cycle. Identify what metrics are important to your health and track them each week. Compare the averages of the weeks of your cycle. The more we learn and share about ourselves, the richer our knowledge will be of something that affects 50% of the population every month. Because our menstrual cycles are so much more than bloating, cramping, and bleeding. There's actually a really positive side to it.